Now, it's no secret that the UFC doesn't pay its fighters well, or even good at all, but when you gotta risk your life in an octagon for at least 15 to 25 minutes after having trained for months, cutting weight, having to eat vegetables every day, and you still end up making less money than Alex Pereira when he was working at a tire shop, I think there's an issue. But what if I told you it's not actually the UFC's fault? After doing some digging, and it hurts me to say this, maybe Dana White isn't as evil as we think he is, because what I found is that the UFC can't actually pay its fighters well, or it will cease to exist, and it has to do with three major reasons the UFC is heavily trying to avoid at all costs. But before we delve into that, have you ever wondered how Alex Pereira went from working at a tire shop to almost catching a body against Khalil Roundtree as the light heavyweight champion of the world? Well, he invested in himself and got the right program. And if you're looking to level up your striking game, check out the online programs by Muay Thai guy Sean Fagan. A couple of his best programs are the Fighter's Body Academy and the Heavy Bag Blueprint, which include cool bonuses like free premium gloves. Now, if you're interested in the Heavy Bag Blueprint but don't want to pay the full $297, you can get the new 3.0 version starting at just $47. Check out the links below in the description and pinned comment and start hitting like a truck. Now, I wasn't joking when I said it actually isn't the UFC's fault, because the first 2 points that I have here actually reveal an unfortunate truth that I think most of us overlook and refuse to believe. But for us to understand that unfortunate truth, we first have to look at my first point, where the UFC has horrible deals with networks and broadcasters that force it to put on shows almost every week. Some of you may not know this, but after surviving an atrocious deal with Fox, the UFC entered into a $1.5 billion deal with ESPN. The horrible app that they have forces the UFC to put on 30 events per year across the ESPN platforms. So as UFC fans, you're probably like, why is this a bad thing? Isn't it good that we get more events every week? I have something to watch on Saturdays. But what some of you might not be realizing is that this is a contract agreement on paper, which means that in real life, this often doesn't end up well, and we're seeing it over the last few years how it's been going. We have the UFC Apex, which has been milked to the point of no return. I think the UFC Apex has been milked more than Rockstar Games has milked GTA 5 Online. The UFC makes sure that they have an event to go no matter what. Even if the card is horrible and they have to put early prelim fighters that have 30 losses and never actually fought in the UFC as the main card, they will do it, because the UFC is not looking to have another lawsuit on the hands and pile of lawsuits that they're already dealing with. But I haven't even got into the worst part, which brings me to my next point. The UFC is hurting fighters with this deal because it needs them to fight as often as possible. Now, if you look at the active UFC roster, there's roughly 600 fighters that are on the roster. Now, some of you might forget that the UFC actually has an obligation to us fans to keep the rankings moving. So on top of these 30 events that they need to do minimum per year, they need to have the fighters fight enough so that rankings keep moving, and we aren't just kept waiting for the divisions to move on. Even though I know sometimes, John Jones and all these other people keep the division waiting, the UFC is trying to make sure that the rankings keep on going and the UFC keeps on flowing. I actually didn't even mean for that to rhyme. Get what I mean? And on top of that, we have Dana White's Contender Series, where he's actively recruiting more and more fighters, which is bringing the roster up even more. And that means they have to put on even more events so that all the roster can have a fight once a year at minimum. Now, this is a terrible thing, because not only are the fighters risking their life multiple times a year to get horrible pay, but the UFC is now forced to do more than 30 events a year, which is often what ends up happening. And with the more events that you have a year, the UFC will have to divide its budget into even smaller portions to hand out to the fighters. See, as a corporation and being partnered with holding companies that the UFC has, they have an obligation to keep their financials as consistent as possible. They can't risk having to put certain budgets on certain fighters unless there's someone like Conor McGregor, or it's like a big pay-per-view event where they know the return on ad spend, return on investment is gonna do really well. See, unlike boxing, where it's like a bunch of promotions against each other, where they don't have 600 fighters on their promotion, the UFC has to stay consistent with the same roster and make sure they actually fight every year. Or the UFC would literally have like 4 different promotional belts for every single division, and we would have no idea who's actually the undisputed champion anymore. There would be like the IBF Pro, the IBF, the Intercontinental, like all that stuff would just confuse us. So we have one main belt for every division, and we have to have certain amount of fighters fight every year so that division keeps moving. But believe it or not, all this that I've said is actually not even the worst part, where this actually brings me to the unfortunate truth that we as fight fans, and honestly the fighters themselves, have to accept. And this truth is that if the UFC actually paid its fighters well, fighters themselves would actually refuse to fight if they got paid well. Now, some of you might disagree with this, but if you look at other promotions and if you look at UFC fighters that have been paid well, where are they now? Definitely not fighting. Unless they're Alex Pereira or some big exception, someone who actually appreciates how they've came up and sees the sort of opportunities that they have now. Most UFC fighters do not end up fighting as actively when they get paid well. Now, it would be easy for me to just use Conor McGregor as an example here, but this is actually a real issue that the UFC is trying to avoid, where if they pay the fighters too well, the fighters will actually refuse to fight because under their agreement, they can't actually force the fighter to fight. They just have to fight a certain amount of fights under their contract. So if the UFC fighter got paid a good amount after being used to getting paid horribly, you know, a lot of people just go like, okay, you know, I'm getting paid pretty well, I don't really need to fight as often a year anymore, and ultimately hurts the UFC. Now just look at Colby Covington. Now if you still don't believe me, just look at this chart of the top 15 in each division and look at all the highlighted green names. These are all people that have been inactive for over a year. That's right, these guys got paid well to the point where they could actually take off a year and take their time and hold up the rankings in the division. Now sure, some of them might be injured and certain circumstances happen, but I want you to take in that there's other fighters that could be inactive for 11 months, 10 months, right? Pretty much a year, these long spans of time that affect the UFC and their contract system that they have. And it is these top 15 ranked fighters and champions that get paid among the best salaries and fight contracts among the UFC. So you're seeing a pattern here. The more the fighter earns, the less they fight. Now you can't really blame them, but that's just how the math works out. That's how the contract and the system that's being built here actually works out, which is why the UFC has created a standard and a culture where they pay their fighters horribly so that they have them under control and actively fighting throughout the years. And some of you might say, oh, look at Pride, look at one championship, they paid their fighters $1 million per fight. But yeah, look at them in comparison to the UFC. The UFC is worth way more than them. The UFC doesn't rely on third-party investors and people offshore to hand them their financials, right? The UFC has a long-term system here that no other fighting promotion has been able to match. Like just look at one championship. They signed Jake Paul, they signed Francis Ngannou, right? Francis Ngannou even has a fight coming up, but you don't see many people talking about it because we look at other promotions as not as elite as the UFC, even though there might be. But that's why we all watch the UFC. It's the hub of mixed martial arts for us globally as fans. So this is why I say it's not actually the UFC's fault, because they're just trying to protect what they actually made. The UFC would be a lot more different if it went towards a more utopian style where they paid everyone fairly, and it would just hinder the actual brand and the actual quality that the UFC brings out, because the fighters would not be as fighting as often. We wouldn't be seeing as many events a year, and ultimately some of you might not be as big of fans of the UFC if there wasn't as many events. It is a paradoxical sort of situation. It's kind of unfortunate on both sides. In my opinion, I wish the UFC would just invest a little more, or a lot more honestly, into their fighter pay. I think these fighters deserve way more than they get. You know, when you have athletes that all they do is play basketball or play volleyball and all these other sports that ultimately actually have less viewership globally than the UFC, and they still get paid more because of their contractual situation. Meanwhile, these UFC fighters are risking their lives. They're getting hurt like crazy. They have so many expenses to pay, and they still get like chump change. I think it's pretty unfortunate. Hopefully there's something, you know, the UFC's deal with ESPN is expiring in 2025. Hopefully the UFC can find a better investor, a better partner that'll actually look at the fighters' health and the fighters' future overall. And hopefully we can go from there. But that's what I think. That's why I think it's not actually the UFC's fault. It's definitely not the fighters' fault at all either. But it's just this paradox that we have. And I hope you enjoy it. Let me know what you think.